So I'm going to invite now Steve Young to come and talk to us. They were fellow PhD students under Keith Barnett in the spectroscopy group. Right. So we're going to learn about Danny as a fellow PhD student.
Indeed.
And let me just, we'll get the logistics here. So to make you concentrate more by turning the lights down a little bit. So what we'll do is yours, Danny. The microphone.
Yep. Can you hear me? Jolly good. Good afternoon. I've just come up from Dartmoor in the southwest of England, where I'm afraid I do very little physics indeed, and spend even less time speaking in great lecture theatres like this. But it is a fantastic honour to be able to take part in this celebration of Danny Siegel. Speaking of whom, there he is, on saddle tour, very near where I live. You can tell it's him by his barber flat cap and glasses. What you can't see there is the silly grin on his face. Here's another one of him, taken very nearby with my children about 5 years ago. I just love that photo, I'm afraid. He looks like some kind of superhero. So I just had to put it in. I've known Danny for over 28 years, and we've been best mates for pretty much all of that time. I realise this lecture theatre is pretty well packed with physicists. I need to tell you that I am not going to be talking physics. I could just about remember the title of my PhD thesis. So I don't know anything about ion trapping or quantum computing, but fortunately I am a leading authority on what a tremendous bloke Danny Siegel was. So it all started in 1987 when I was just finishing my first degree here. I thought I'd have a look at doing a PhD, and so I joined the tours of the research groups and found myself in the basement of this building, listening to a very enthusiastic PhD student wearing baggy green combat trousers and little round John Lennon glasses, talking very enthusiastically about his research into collisional redistribution. Now, I saw straight away that, like me, he was good-looking, witty, lively, enthusiastic, and, of course, clever. In short, he was cool. Actually, not at all like me, but as soon as I'd convinced his boss, the indomitable Keith Barnett, to take me on as his next PhD student, with Danny as the postdoc, I began to realise that I'd got in with an excellent team. In fact, this is the first thing I advise people when they're asking me about doing a PhD. I say, make sure you're working with good people. And I don't just mean clever. These were really good people, and it was brilliant to work with them. As I recall, Danny finished his PhD here sometime late in '87, so he became Dr. Dan. But before I could even start, Keith had become a fellow at St. John's College in Oxford. And loyal boss that he was, he asked Danny and I to go with him to pursue the research in the Clarendon lab. So during the couple of months before the move, Danny had to explain to me the YAG laser and the dye laser used in his experiment, and then we had to pull his entire experiment to pieces and pack it up for the move. It was during this time that we'd chat as we worked, and I began to realise what an eminently reasonable person Danny was. Now, that seems like a strange adjective to pick out of all the ones possible for Danny, but my overriding recollection was that whatever aspect of life I raised, he'd already thought about it deeply and rationalised it into a conclusion that was utterly reasonable. So as a brand new postgrad student, still only half-baked, I used to talk about everything with Danny, and I learnt a hell of a lot from him. For example, take the subject of marriage. He was already married to Helen, and although he had found perfection, his wisdom on marriage was thus. He said, you may never find perfection as someone who wants what you want all of the time. But what you will do, if you're lucky, is find somebody for whom it is worth compromising. Classic Danny. Of course, I went and married a stripper from Bognor Regis, but I never forgot his wise words. So Danny would gently lay down his wisdom on me like some kind of sage. And I suspect he never knew how influential he was on my development as a person. So once we got to Oxford, we started to build the experiment. Oh, that's disappointing. Oh, I'll move there. Started to build our experiment in the basement, in our basement lab in the Clarendon. Very briefly, tiny bit of physics. Keith wanted to look at the effect of an intense laser field on resonance collisions between two atoms of the same type, in this case neon. The idea was that because it could all be very neatly described mathematically, the field and the atom and the two atoms colliding, that it would provide a very neat framework for a theoretical and experimental investigation. So, that's what we started to do. I found this photo in a pack of prints last week, and I really couldn't decide whether that was me or Danny. In the same pack was this photo of me. It's not as creepy as it looks, but we had the same bad haircut, according to Helen. We even wore the same patterned jumpers, for heaven's sake. And we were accused of being brothers on more than one occasion, which for me was not a problem. Not sure what Danny thought of it, though. So we carried on working away for many years, actually, it was. We spent the whole of my 3 years of D-field grants trying to find the signature of intense field atom interaction. And it was very elusive. I can't remember why it was so difficult, but it was. And we were working hard all the time, but we also had a great laugh while we were doing it. We got on brilliantly. We worked well. But I remember being asked to stop laughing so uproariously in the Clarendon tea room on many occasions because we were disrupting serious conversations that were going on around us. But after 2.5 years, we got nothing. We got no signal. The only time I ever saw Danny get cross was when he got cross with me when I discovered him researching the spectroscopic structure of mercury secretly. He'd got this idea that if we swapped the neon for mercury, we'd get more signal, and we might be able to get the experiment to work. So I discovered him doing this. I know what you're doing, I said. Why shouldn't I? He said, with a slight frown. That was as cross as he got with me. And that was the nearest we came to having an argument in 28 years. He was feeling under pressure to get the experiment working. And even then he was only doing it for my sake. And as it turns out, the switch to mercury proved to be a masterstroke for that experiment. It was hot down in the basement, especially in the summer. And a certain Professor Hughes at Durham reminded me recently of the time he sent his Polish lady PhD colleague, Małgosia, down from his lab to our lab to get a tin of elbow grease. And she walked into our lab through the door here to see Danny and I working behind the table here. Shirts off, sweating. It was that hot. We grinned at Małgosia. Małgosia screamed and ran out of the lab. You see, we were also wearing shorts which were completely concealed by the table, leaving her to draw the terrifying conclusion that we were working naked, which we only did very rarely. It was those days in Oxford that Danny's obsession with blues music became apparent to me, and that stepped up a big gear when he answered an advert for blues musicians to start a band in Oxford. And he invited the advertiser, one Dave Watkins, who is here, I believe, somewhere. There he is. He came along to the Clarendon tea room, and while Danny and Dave enthused about Fenders and Gibsons and Muddy Waters, I realised that I was sitting in on the formation of the Bloodhounds. Will that work? Yes. There's the Bloodhounds. And just for your information, there's Dave. And there's Graham, who's also up there. Busy busking in Oxford City Centre, making a nice pile of cash, I suspect. Causing a bit of a stir amongst the local ladies and amongst the local constabulary. And occasionally the ladies in the constabulary. I think she was actually asking for Graham's phone number. So one summer's day we lined up with the other staff and students and researchers in the Clarendon in the park outside the lab for the Clarendon group photo. The photographer lined us all up on the gantry, and as he got to look into his camera, Danny and I whipped on our Groucho noses and stood grinning inanely. Unfortunately, he spotted us. Gentlemen, please, put the noses down. 3 times he tried to take a photo. 3 times we whipped on the noses, until on the 4th time he gave us the photo we wanted. I don't know what year that was, 1989 or something. You can see us there. Very soon to be Professor Danny Siegel there, taking things very seriously. So as my 3rd and final year of grant ran out, and I started to live on my credit card, at that point we got the first bit of intense field signal, and we were able to start to proceed with getting some data. I remember the moment well. We saw the signal, Danny shut the experiment down, and we emerged into the sunshine to have an ice cream in the park, just in case the signal went away. So we rapidly obtained the data we needed, and by mid-1991, Danny's work at the Clarendon was done. So leaving Keith and I to do the theoretical bit, and obviously to write up, Danny considered his next move in academia very carefully and immediately moved back to Imperial to work with Richard, which I suspect is where his physics heart always lay. So our working lives went separate ways in '91, but as Danny had come to, I'd come to regard him as the older brother I might have had. So it was automatic for me to ask him to be my best man at my wedding in '95. And before you ask, Penny did not come from Bognor Regis. Of course, he did best man brilliantly, with a speech that brought the house down, and the Bloodhounds played all night. But there was one little detail I'll never forget. In the morning, before we went to the church, I was in a bit of a flap, and Danny tied my tie for me. Perfect double Windsor. See, my tie looks better than his tie. When Danny and I weren't comparing notes on designing and building our own house extensions, we admired each other's landscape paintings, another common interest we had. Danny was a great fan of the Impressionists, and you can see how, Monet influenced his style. Always loved that painting by him, an oil. While we're at it, there's one of mine that he liked. He had impeccable taste, of course. And I presume he did this oil while sitting at an easel somewhere in his beloved France, or maybe Spain. Not long before he got ill, we all went to join friends for New Year's Eve in the Lake District, and I took this photo of the common room. I don't know who was more drunk or how Danny photobombed this long exposure picture, but I called that photo at the time the Smiley Happy Ghost. Was that prophetic? This is how I think of him now. To me, he was simply the best man that I ever knew. Thank you.